It's now been over 15 years since Warcraft 3 came out and set the bar for full 3D RTS games, and we'll be getting that remaster soon. Trademark. Hopefully it comes out later this year as planned. What matters is that there's been a whole lot of advancement since Reign of Chaos first came out for PC. Since Warcraft 3, we've seen the last hurrah, death, and post-mortem defilement of rival franchise Command & Conquer, the return of StarCraft to the top spot of the RTS world, and the rise of entire genres that rose out of the map editor from Warcraft 3. I've got a soft spot for the original trilogy of Warcraft games, as Warcraft 2 was my very first game that wasn't about learning shapes and colors. Come to think of it, I might have some faint memories of the Indiana Jones Adventures game in preschool and playing on my NES. It doesn't matter. Warcraft 2 was the first game I remember getting really into. Warcraft 2 was a little charlatan's first introduction to PC gaming, which has been my primary means of playing video games ever since. Warcraft 3 was the first game that I got really excited for the release of, as I learned that not all games had just existed since the beginning of time in my dad's magical CD binder, and they were still making those games, and wow, look, they're even cooler now. They're 3D, they're doing stuff, you can watch the buildings like being built. I remember after my dad downloaded the teaser for the Warcraft 3 base game, I just come home and watch it over and over again on my PC because I was hype as hell, and my dad was probably happy that the kids weren't watching Disney movies over and over again for once. Once it came out, I watched my dad play for the most part, since elementary school me wasn't quite up to the task of playing through the entire campaign in a timely manner, but you can bet once my dad finished up, I played the crap out of that game. After we had both eventually made our way through the game, my old man seemed dissatisfied with the game in comparison to StarCraft and Warcraft 2. At first I thought he was crazy, but now that I've replayed the game in anticipation for Reforged, I think I can see what he didn't like. After playing Reign of Chaos and Frozen Throne back to back and scrutinizing them, I have to admit that, well, yes, Warcraft 3 was a great leap forward for RTS games. It was also a step back in a few places. Now, this isn't so much of a Warcraft 3 is garbage and here's why type video, as much as it is a video containing a personal wish list of things that I really hope Blizzard tries to change or at least improve upon now that they've had time to work on it some more, and more importantly, now that technology is a lot better, a lot of the things that kind of sucked about Warcraft 3 don't really need to be there anymore. A second or so ago, I mentioned technology being a lot better than it was 15 years ago. And a lot of things that I really hope that get addressed in Reforged have to do with choices they made in the name of optimization and hardware limitations at the time. Warcraft 3 was one of the first 3D RTS games at the time, period. There weren't very many other than Warcraft 3. And it had some of the best texturing and fine detail on the characters for a while. That came at a price. The first and most annoying of which is the Upkeep System. In case you somehow aren't familiar with that despite clicking through to this video, the Upkeep System is when you hit a certain number of supply usage during the course of playing a map, you'll be notified that you hit a certain stage of upkeep, low, medium, or high. This means that because reasons, the game is going to take some of the resources that your workers collect off the top. The higher your supply utilization and upkeep is, the more the game is going to take off the top of whatever your workers are collecting. You can't really rationalize it in-game, as buildings don't decay in a matter of days, requiring the expenditure of resources to maintain them, plus you gotta expend resources doing repairs when your buildings are attacked. So what's the upkeep for? Plus, farms already supply the food and what have you to the units, so what, are we having to pay logistical costs? Or are you insinuating that we pay our cultist acolytes? The result of this in-game is that late game is slow to a crawl because everything costs a lot of money, but now you're making money about half as fast. I take it that this was very likely to make sure that once you built up a lot of cash, you couldn't just swarm units everywhere and slow down the game. But, come on, guys. It's hard to skirt around this too by leaving your defenses open with loads of towers, because the towers can't hit everything, especially since siege units are specifically designed to be out of the range of towers. So you're going to have some units for fighting, and on top of that, workers count for upkeep. This means that when it's finally time to have big late game units that take a high level of tech and a lot of money, you can only get a handful of them, which is also likely because you look at stuff like the Frostworm or the Tauren, and they've got a lot of moving parts. You'll likely maybe only have 2 or 3 of whatever your late game is because, well, there's only a supply cap of 90 in this game. Let's talk about that supply cap. It's very much in the name of making sure that your 2003 era GPUs didn't melt right out of the computers they were housed in while playing Warcraft 3. You've got all of 90 units of supply in which to build your army, including workers, which is less than half of what you got in the last game, StarCraft. It doesn't exactly help things that nearly all your units cost a bit more than in previous games. Everything except for maybe your workers costs like 2 or 3 supply. In previous games, nearly all factions had at least one combat unit that only costed 1 supply so that you could have a quick and disposable army at Tech 1. In Warcraft 3, you can realistically maybe get several dozen units into an army once you account for the supply that workers will take up, unless you get really creative with summonable units. Even with cheats, you're only going to be maybe able to get up to like 110 supply in total, which is likely because someone at Blizzard had the sense to think, okay, if we have huge fights in this with all these moving parts on 3D graphics, if let's say everybody brings a big army to a fight, PCs are going to burst into flames. This is very likely to make sure that your average gaming PC at the time could handle big multiple faction fights in multiplayer. There are ways to try and get around this, and likely certain custom maps could find a way to just get rid of supply cap issues, but at the end of the day, if you just want to play a good old-fashioned skirmish match, you're not going to be able to bring 100 guys. Unless we're counting summoned skeletons. Lastly, while not directly related to optimization and hardware limitation, the time missions felt a good bit on the excessive side during the campaign. I'd easily accept that this was done because most Blizzard RTS survival missions are filed under, you have been pitted against an enemy with significant control of the map, a much higher tech level than you're able to achieve, and there's almost no way that you can make any gains against the AI. They're going to progressively throw more and more dudes at you for about 30 minutes until at the last minute they toss a crap load of enemies at you that you will not be able to fend off, and they'll start wrecking your base, but they will not be able to kill you by the time the timer hits 0 and the mission ends. Like seriously, that's about 90% of all timed missions in Blizzard RTSs. I think nearly every campaign in the base game of Warcraft 3 has at least one, except for maybe the orcs. And you think everything's cool in the final campaign with the Night Elf mission, like, okay, the stealth mission was weird, but I get that it was to show off the Night Elf's natural ability, and then right at the end, whammo! Grand finale's a timer mission. To make things even better, in previous games, there were survival missions, but if you likely used cheats or were just some ungodly good RTS player, you could beat the enemy, and if you somehow did beat the enemy, the mission would just automatically end prematurely. Not the case for the finale of Warcraft 3. Congratulations, you slam-jammed on Trichondrius using a cheat code, but you still gotta hang out for another 25 minutes, bucko. Cheaters never prosper. While all of these things are pretty annoying, all these things can also be easily fixed now that modern systems have the ability to render a lot of moving parts without incident. Upkeep would be the easiest to get rid of. You just get rid of it, easy fix. Supply cap and timer levels would be a bit more complicated to do because simply bumping up the supply limit to 200 would be easy until you consider that most of the maps in the campaign were made for a supply cap of 90. Like, not as in like, oh, the processor can't handle it, but things are already a little crowded going through certain like lanes of travel when you have a dozen units. What happens when you have like 100 units trying to get through the same place? I'm sure somebody at that giant compound in Irvine is smart enough to figure it out though. As for the timer mission, it's just, I don't know, maybe cut the times in half because nobody wants to sit around for 45 minutes waiting for the undead to throw a few more guys at you. What might not be so easy to rework in Warcraft 3 is the heavy reliance on hero units. The game is pretty much built around hero units, with summoning altars being one of the first major tech buildings that you can get. There are camps of neutral enemies everywhere that are basically existing to let you farm up your heroes without having to engage the AI or another player. And there are shops where you can dump all your gold on instead of, you know, your army, because no, let's not get +3 attack for our entire army. Let's just go to the goblin shop and get a set of +6 claws of attack for one particular unit. It's okay, you can resurrect these guys if they die. There's almost nothing that hero units can't do. Hero units will often be able to take on entire squads by themselves, which makes their purchase more cost effective than raising a traditional army, especially when that upkeep system comes into play, because maybe like maxing out like a trio of heroes is going to cost 12 supply, whereas an army that is the equivalent of them is going to cost like 50 or 60 supply, and you're going to be hamstrung by the upkeep system. Other units are effectively backup when everyone's got their heroes in play. Maybe you'll have a few fighters and a healer around for when you're farming up levels, but after you get all your heroes leveled up with all their summonables, items, and what have you, heroes can effectively rush enemy bases with maybe a few siege units in the back to clean up the buildings while the heroes wipe out everything else. Conventional armies are always going to have to take a backseat to your trio of level 10 overpowered wrecking balls. This isn't to say that you can't forego hero units during campaigns and skirmish fights, but you're almost always going to be better off focusing on your given hero units than building an army. The army is more like, okay, these are your backup dancers. Don't forget to blow all your gold at the goblin shop! Shredders are cool though. Hero units are very much a double-edged sword. They certainly do a good job of tying the story to the gameplay, and they help keep the game interesting, especially in the early stages before you can mass up an army. Also, having units that each are effectively a one-person army really helps out with the limitations on how many moving parts and moving units you can have that your typical computer can handle circa 2003. Hero units are also, like I whined about earlier, very good at leading a charge into a built-up area. Say you're playing a race with some more squishy attack units like the Night Elves, your heroes are probably going to be able to soak up a lot of the abuse to let all your archers and what have you get in there and start really doing damage. However, if this was the best way of doing things, they would have carried Altars of Whatever or other hero summoning units into StarCraft 2. Well, come to think of it, they sorta did when they introduced Tychus Finley into the co-op part of the game, but they sure as hell haven't put it into the core game. The closest we've got is Heart of the Swarm's obsession with Kerrigan, but that was like a one-time thing compared to Wings of Liberty and Legacy of the Void. Without heroes, we also likely would have never got the entire genre of MOBA, as well as all the other great stuff that came out of the use of hero units in tandem with the map editor. Yes, Eon of Strife was a thing, but you still have StarCraft's clunky way of upgrading stuff in custom maps where you had to click away from the action and go to a cluster of tech buildings. It's not a very good way to keep the action going. And yes, there was also Command & Conquer Soul Survivors way back in the mid-90s, but that wasn't very fleshed out either. Aeon of Strife and Soul Survivor are more like the Neanderthal and the Australopithecus to Dota's Cro-Magnon. This was the start of a game genre's evolution into a fully fledged thing, but it came at the cost of de-emphasizing the real-time strategy in a real-time strategy game. I think a good way to fix this setback would be to focus more on bringing that supply cap up to 200 like in the StarCraft games. While a group of heroes can take on maybe a couple dozen units in a straight up fight if they're all leveled up, they're not going to be able to take on 100 units at once. So as long as they don't massively buff heroes to Heart of the Swarm levels of OP, we could likely still have our heroes and our armies at the same time. Hero units would still be a good way to keep the early game going, as well as a good way to start a major push on an enemy base, but they would not be the center of the game's combat. Something else that might not be the center of people's focus when comparing the entries into the Warcraft franchise, but is certainly something that I was a big fan of, is the Naval Combat that was added into Warcraft 2. I was always a big fan of rushing to dominate all the oil deposits on the map in Warcraft 2, and I'd eventually work my way up into a total naval domination, and seeing if I could wipe out an enemy base without deploying a single unit onto land. There was also the added element of figuring out where exactly you could land troop transports on your enemy's soil, and how to best protect the spots where your enemy is most likely going to try and land drop ships on your base. You also got some sweet sea shanties from your orc ships. This is entirely absent in Reign of Chaos, and it severely disappoints me. Naval combat was removed and largely replaced by air units when it comes to transportation and rapid response combat units. Almost all the maps in Warcraft 3 are either entirely landlocked or have minimal water, mountain ranges, or other physical barriers preventing land-based units from just walking on over to the enemy base. There are a few segments where you will need to go and find a goblin shop to hire some zeppelins to carry troops over a natural barrier or two, but I miss the experience of loading up all your dudes onto the sea transports and hoping that the landing zone that you picked out for them hadn't had any defenses built on it since you last peeped it. and then that your guys can get out of the boats in time and make it to the enemy base proper before the opposing army can meet you, and you just end up fighting it out a few yards away from the stuff you actually want to destroy. With the flying zeppelins, you can basically drop your dudes off anywhere where they can stand, and you don't so much have to worry about picking a good spot for your landing. As long as there aren't any nearby towers, you're good. Plop them right down wherever, the enemy resource line for all we care. Just put them wherever. They did bring back naval units in the expansion Frozen Throne, but in a much more limited extent than Tides of Darkness. But it was nice to have some boats in Frozen Throne. Like, it was the least they could do after you beat the game in Reign of Chaos, and one of the first things you see in the end credits is they remade the cinematic from Warcraft 2 that shows that they fully designed and modeled the naval ships from the previous game. So at least they gave them to us eventually. Like, you don't get to do all that much with them, but you have them. Maybe if we got them in the multiplayer with maps specifically made for naval combat, including oil deposits, that'd be all we needed. We don't need to drastically alter the story or add new levels to the game we love just to get our big naval battles back. I'd be happy with just having the good old stuff from Warcraft 2 in custom scenarios. Just give me my sea shanty singing orcs back. Whew, that was a tongue twister. Let's move on. Now, in spite of all of this and everything I've previously mentioned, Warcraft 3 is still an amazing game whose pros far outweigh any of the cons that I've laid out here. There's a lot of things I really hope Blizzard doesn't change, as I think they hit the nail right on the head the first time around when they implemented them. The means in which they did the storytelling in this game is probably one of the best I've seen, with the only real contender being Blizzard's own StarCraft 2 Wings of Liberty. The combination of having a little map and synopsis at the loading screen to give you an idea of where we are, followed by an in-game in-engine cutscene that ends right at the start of the level that you are going to play, was great for getting immersed into that particular level and the game overall. It was so smooth compared to other means of explaining the stories in an RTS before the level. I still love that FMV related camp, but it's just nowhere near as seamless as what Warcraft 3 had going on for it. Pair these with the awesome cinematics that you got at least once per campaign, and you're having an awesome time. I don't really think that there's any way to improve on what they've got here, as I don't think Wings of Liberty's method of storytelling and level selection would work very well with Warcraft 3's linear campaign. So I'm rooting for Blizzard to keep things how they are, just in this particular area. I'm also really pulling for a similar multiplayer system that Warcraft 3 had, particularly the map editor, which has been confirmed. Thank goodness. They said they're going to improve on some things, which I personally would not mind at all, if like the Battle.net friend system is involved for the new Warcraft 3, or even just connecting it to my Steam account, since I don't really use Battle.net's friend system, but it was easy to get in. It was easy to make stuff in the custom map editor. Heck, 8-year-old me was able to make functioning maps with it. However, other level editors were so good that they could make entire genres of games with them. How many map editors do you know that are so easy a literal child can use them, but still able to go so deep that you can create something entirely new with them? I'm also a huge fan of the great unit synergies you got in Warcraft 3 that kept things fresh when you were playing. Even during the playthrough I did for this video, I found new ways to screw around with unit combos. Admittedly, these are things that likely normal people initially found during their first few playthroughs, but holy moly, it's fun trying to crash a game by seeing how many skeletons you can summon with necromancers and meat wagons when you've got the mana cheat running. This was likely worked on in the name of making things interesting, given how low the supply cap is and how they've got the upkeep system making sure you don't build too fast, and it certainly did its job. Blizzard did an excellent job on how all the normal units work together to do really cool stuff. And lastly, I really hope they keep the original voice acting from Warcraft 3. They weren't exactly the finest in voice acting as far as video games were going, but they're delightfully hammy and hokey. Between the line delivery and the not so Oscar-worthy dialogue writing, it makes for a good time, like a Deus Ex kind of good time. I know this is a little thing in the scope of remastering a game, but I really do hope they keep all these old voice lines, the map editor, and the way they told the story. I'm likely going to be happy with Warcraft 3 Reforged, no matter what gets changed or stays the same. This has been a nice exercise in wishful thinking though, and it would be pretty cool to have 200 on 200 Necromancer meat wagon fights flexing our modern CPU muscles. A guy can dream, right? If the StarCraft remaster is anything to go off for a point of reference, Blizzard takes their original properties which made them big in the first place very seriously, and they aren't going to do anything potentially damaging to them. We're likely going to get a very familiar but facelifted experience, and all the suggestions are just wishful thinking. Nonetheless, it's probably going to be great, and if anything, we're going to get a hot, fresh new map editor. That's going to wrap it up for today. Now, the timing of this video is no mistake or an out-of-the-blue thing. Some of my happiest childhood memories were of playing Warcraft with my dad, and what better video to make than something about Warcraft during Father's Day weekend. I really don't get to see my dad that much anymore now that he's moved about 1,000 miles away for the big job in the big office, but it's always nice to have the games that remind me of the good times. Do me a favor this Father's Day and at least give your dad a call this weekend. Sign-offs are stupid, and I love you, Dad. I hope Tatiana and I can come out this November to see you, Mom, and everyone else. Bye. Kat, what have you done? What have you done? What have you done? What have you done? You ruined my cable management. Yes, this was totally your doing. This is gonna take a while.